Thank you, Lord Chairman. I should record my non-financial interests as Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong and as a patron of Hong Kong Watch. Thank you very much for the evidence that you've given us this morning. How does China assess its own security threats? What does it identify as existential threats? And perhaps in that context, we have on July the 1st the 25th anniversary of the handing over of Hong Kong to Beijing. Does it see democracy and human rights and the rule of law? Does it see those as existential threats? How was the UK's tilt to the Indo-Pacific assessed? And has the war in Ukraine had any impact on China's security thinking, not least in the context of Taiwan? And I note what you say in your paper about the slogan doing the rounds in Taiwan, but Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow.
Absolutely. Thank you for your questions. In terms of what the CCP views as its ultimate threat, I think the preservation of the party and regime survival and stability is its main goal. So anything that threatens those things are seen as the largest threats to China writ large. In order to, I think, address those concerns, there are threat perceptions in China that are founded on a belief that Western countries and liberal democracies as such have an aim led by the United States to overthrow the CCP, to provoke regime change in China, and also geographically to encircle China and to contain China. National security, as it's termed under President Xi Jinping, under a concept of comprehensive national security, however, is very broad to understand and quite vague in the sense that it encompasses a whole range of different issues, ranging from what we might consider traditional, military, territorial, technological security, but it also goes so far as to include ecological, societal, polar, cyber, space, cultural, political, economic, bio, deep sea, resource, nuclear, and overseas interest security as well. So I think what this shows is that security, at the end of the day, in China as a concept, can be leveraged by the CCP to as an argument or as a reason to enact policies that, again, pursue those goals of preservation of the party and regime stability. I think China's view of its current security status needs to be considered both internally and externally. Internally, of course, it's very much struggling with COVID at the moment under its still ostensibly a zero COVID policy, which I think it is finding difficult to move away from, and in some ways this year will not move away from, keeping in mind the important political milestone of the 20th Party Congress and President Xi Jinping's likely third term as president and party chair. I think, of course, there's an economic cost to that, which is a very significant security concern for the party's own legitimacy within China and its promise of continued prosperity for current and future generations of China. Externally, I think that we see a shift in how China views its current security environment compared to what it did in 2015. So in 2015, in the National Defense White Paper, it was outlined that at that moment, a global war was extremely unlikely, and the international environment was favorable to Chinese interests. And so we saw a number of different policies being enacted, not least, the first steps in military reform as well. Today, I think that reflection might be a little different, of course, keeping in mind what's happening in Ukraine with Russia, also keeping in mind what the CCP views very much as a containment strategy of Cold War mentality and zero-sum competition between the United States and its allies and China. And so again, there's a more critical view of China internationally that China sees as one that is impacting its security both externally and internally. With regards to how it viewed the Indo-Pacific tilt by the United Kingdom, I would say that government-linked think tanks and academics viewed this as in two ways. Firstly, arguably a logical move by the United Kingdom for prosperity reasons, so focusing on the Indo-Pacific region due to its economic center of gravity within the global economy in the future, and one that made sense in a post-Brexit and global Britain world. So in that sense, it was welcomed. On the other hand, the term Indo-Pacific in China is very much linked to, again, that view of a U.S.-led containment, Cold War mentality, policy and initiative. And so in that sense, using that term in the Indo-Pacific was a signal to these think tankers in China and in Beijing in particular, of the UK taking sides of the United States in this larger strategic competition. I think there were also questions, for example, about specific elements of how the Indo-Pacific tilt has been operationalized since it was announced, not least the carrier strike group's maiden voyage to the Indo-Pacific. There are questions from Chinese policymakers as to what the actual objective of that was and what reasons the UK had for deploying a ship to the Indo-Pacific. And if I can point just to your last question on the impact of the war in Ukraine by Russia on China's security thinking, I think there are three notable impacts that we can point to. First, though Russia and China do not have an alliance as such, they have what they term deep partnership that knows no bounds. There is also, of course, mutual mistrust between the two, but I think there's no denying that there was an attempt by leadership of Russia and China to leverage this relationship to form a unified bloc in opposition to Western liberal democracies and values in the international system, and propose an alternative to that. I think the repercussions of the war in Ukraine on Russia, both economically and politically, perhaps, will now mean that the CCP's most significant partner in international relations is potentially a lot weaker as an actor on the international stage. And of course, that the potentially combined strength of that partnership may have, in our perception, become weaker. Secondly, and something that I focused on in my work, the People's Liberation Army, so the party's military, will of course be watching the performance of the Russian armed forces very closely, how they perform in Ukraine's successes or failures, and attempt to learn from that for the past, particularly when it comes to contingencies such as Taiwan and PLA future operations. But I think it's also really important for the PLA to look at the moment, and what I imagine they will be assessing is questions related to accurate intelligence gathering, and second of all, loyalty and assumptions within their own military. And thirdly, if I may, I think the Western and wider response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine will also be watched very closely by Beijing, not least the types of sanctions imposed on Russia, but very much the role of the private sector in all of this, which will, I think, have come as a surprise to Beijing. And lastly, of course, they'll be watching the longevity of these sanctions.
Thank you very much for that very thorough and comprehensive reply. Can I tempt you further on the question of Taiwan as to whether you actually think that what has happened in Ukraine makes it less or more likely that we will see these regular military excursions in the air above Taiwan extend to a full military invasion? And given that territorial disputes was one of the factors that you listed in the list that you gave us, the depletion of Russia, its diminished status to that of a client state, where does that leave that partnership that knows no bounds that you referred to? And also, does it suit China, Beijing, to see the United States distracted by Europe and the swallowing up of our stockpiles of weapons, for instance, and military capability by Ukraine?
Three large questions. Again, I'll do my best to be brief. On the first one, the AD's incursions by the PLA Air Force and aviation units of the Navy, as well as the ground forces of the PLA, serve a number of purposes. They serve the purpose of testing the Taiwanese, but also of testing capabilities within the PLA that will be necessary for a future contingency. They also, of course, send useful political signals and play a role in psychological warfare on Taiwan. Those things aside, I don't see at the moment a change in the PLA's operation that would suggest that an invasion is imminent or likely. And whether or not that timeline has changed for CCP leadership with regards to resolving the Taiwan problem, as they call it, through forced unification, really depends on what you think that timeline was in the first place. And I ascribe to the thinking that that timeline is most likely longer than we think that it is, for the reasons of the fact that PLA modernization has not yet been completed, and that from the CCP's perspective, peace or unification is still something that is preferred to a highly risky and politically existential question that could fail through a forced unification. So in that sense, again, I think there will be a period of drawing lessons out and really looking at the PLA where it stands now, and whether the successes viewed within PLA modernization are in fact as successful as was once thought. In terms of the partnership between Russia and China and where a weakened Russia leaves this, in some ways, Beijing has always been the stronger partner in recent years in that bilateral relationship, but has diplomatically, of course, always asserted that it is a partnership of two equals. Economically, technologically, and in some ways, in terms of influence, China has increased its strength within that relationship. And China, of course, in some ways, no longer is dependent on Russia as much as it used to be, for example, in areas of military technological imports. So in some ways, what has happened, I suppose, is that China has graduated to a larger or an older brother status within that relationship. There might be short-term benefits for China in terms of cheaper or economic opportunities within Russia, but of course those have longer-term impacts on Russia itself that China will need to keep in mind. And from the Chinese perspective, as I said, China doesn't do alliances because it doesn't want to be responsible for any other country but China, and it doesn't operate for any other country but China's interests. So in that sense, I think we will have to see wait and see a little bit longer to see what the end status here is of Russia. And from my understanding, I'm not a Russia expert, that is a little bit still in flux. Lastly, in terms of the United States being distracted by Europe, I don't think that the PLA or Chinese leadership assume that the United States is distracted by Europe at the moment. I think there has been careful balancing of commitments, and we, of course, see at the moment that the United States is focusing diplomatically on the Indo-Pacific as much as it is on Europe, with trips to the region planned for the summer as well. So from my perspective and from reading Chinese coverage of this at the moment, it doesn't seem that their assumption is that the United States has taken its eye off the ball.
Thank you very much indeed.